Today on History's Tech, we are looking at the M26 Pershing.
This late 1940s tank was actually designed as a heavy tank to replace the ever-popular M4 Sherman. And while it only served for about 7 years inside the United States Army, it laid the groundwork for the United States to develop probably one of its most popular series of tanks past the Sherman, the Patton tanks. But let's go ahead and look at the history and development of the M26. Now, the origins of the M26 start with the M4 Sherman, the most produced American tank of World War II, with nearly 50,000 tanks produced. And it was a good tank for the time it was produced. And with the continuous upgrades and upguns, it was doing rather well. However, the decision was made that with the M4 Sherman having to compete now against the Tiger II, and the Panther tanks, there was a need for a heavy tank that could take these tanks on and lead the Army into the future. Now, the United States had actually tried to build a heavy tank that could compete with German Army at the start of World War II, and that was the M6 heavy tank. This tank was kind of being developed around the same time as the M3 Lee. However, the whole project was basically abandoned in favor of the M4 Sherman, basically because it was underpowered, had heavy reliability issues, the internal layout was not good, and it was a logistical nightmare due to its weight. So a heavy tank design had been abandoned in favor of the M4 Sherman. Now there was a need for another heavy tank. Now, the development of this tank basically starts off as a replacement for the M4 Sherman that can compete with the Tigers and the Panthers. And so they develop a new series of medium tanks known as the T-20 medium tanks, and it creates a series of them. Now, each of these designs was actually very similar, whether it be the T-20, the T-22, or the T-23. They all went along with the same basic design principle and were modified basically by who manufactured them, whether it be Ford or Chrysler, their engine or their transmissions. Now, while these tanks didn't go anywhere, they became the basis for the development of several new projects, including a new 76mm gun, with the T-23's actual turret being used on the M4 Sherman, becoming the M4E6 Shermans. Now, the final versions of these tanks became known as the T-25 and later T-26, and these were actually a kind of controversial because the Army wanted a tank with way more firepower and armor, and so they began transitioning out of developing a medium tank and developing a heavy tank. They went away with that 76mm turret that they had already been working on and actually upgunned it to a 90mm gun, improved the armor, and they ended up creating the T-26. And the final version of this upgunned, up-armored T-25, T-26 would become later known as the M26 Pershing after Army General John J. Pershing. Now, even with this, it'd actually take a while before the M26 would see any combat. And this is due to multiple factors. Tank doctrine had changed. They went into building tank destroyers instead. There was a need to simplify supply lines, so you couldn't have all these new vehicles being produced all the time. And basically, the Army had become so used to the M4 Sherman, the idea of introducing this new tank kind of got a lot of pushback. But a lot of this is going to change after the Battle of the Bulge. And what we're going to see is the Germans are going to deploy more than 400 Panthers and Tiger IIs during the Battle of the Bulge. And what ends up happening is the United States Army realizes that the M4 Sherman, it can't be used anymore. As much as they liked it, as much as they loved it, they just could not compete anymore. So they went ahead and started immediately shipping what was then the T-26, later the M26, to Europe as quickly as they possibly could. So the Army goes from just having 20 of the Pershings before the Battle of the Bulge to the next couple of months bringing in more than 300. And over the next couple of months, the Pershings proved to actually handle both the Panthers and Tigers rather well, with almost a pretty even back and forth exchange versus where the Sherman was having heavy losses against them. Now, even with these successes, the Germans were figuring out ways of deploying heavier artillery, such as the Nashorn 88mm tank destroyer, 150mm field guns to take it on and to destroy it. Additionally, because of its weight, it couldn't cross traditional bridge systems, and so it had to go across other bridge platforms in order to be utilized, slowing down its movement across Europe. Now, while the tank was more successful than the Sherman, there was a plan to upgun it so that it could handle the King Tiger directly. Now, the initial plan was to take a 73 caliber gun to compete against the 88mm gun of the King Tiger. However, additional modifications were made to this. They changed the barrel length, ammunition cartridges design was changed, allow for better storage. They even used stabilizing springs on the barrel to allow an overall better package, creating what would be known as the Super Pershing. But this basically came at the end of the war, and funding was cut to it, and the whole project was abandoned. And while the end of the war could have spelled the end for the M26, the Korean War kind of kept it going. By this point, the M26 production had basically stopped, and it had been reclassified as a medium tank instead of a heavy tank. And the development began on a new version of the M26 known as the E2, which I'll get to in a moment. Now, because a majority of the tanks available in the area were the M24 Chaffee and the M4A3s, there was a need for what was once a heavy tank, but a heavier medium tank to be able to compete against the T-34-85 models. So the M26 gets deployed to South Korea as quickly as possible, and it actually has a pretty good record against the T-34-85 until its replacement comes along, which is its own variant. Because the M26 was now seen as a medium tank and not a heavy tank, its maneuverability was seen as a problem in that it needed to be faster. So plans were put together for a new power plant, transmission, a redesign of the system for what was initially known as the M26E2, later redesignated the M46 Patton tank. And the M46 Patton would not only take over the role of the M26 had in the Korean War, it would completely replace the M26, and this would be the end of the M26, as the Army would favor the 46 Patton and eventually transition into the entire family of Pattons. And it is here that our story of the Pershing basically ends. By 1951, the United States Army stops utilizing them, and only a handful of countries in Europe will continue using them until basically the early to mid-1960s, with the final tanks being phased out in 1969 by Belgium. Today they can be found as museum pieces in the United States and Europe mainly, and there are a couple that are in working order with some others being worked on. But there you have it, a quick look at the M26 Pershing, a tank that was basically designed to be the successor for the M4 Sherman and actually did a pretty decent job, but due to limitations on power plant and a few other things, and the ever-changing and ever-evolving world of tanks after World War II, it was rather quickly replaced by its own variant, the M46 Patton. And the Patton gave birth to a series of tanks that still are in operation to this day in multiple armies. But that's it for today. I thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you on the next time.